I'm curious about your next book too, The Law of the Sublime, and I'm curious when this is going to come
Wow,
out.
you're really up on these things. I'm
I'm
impressed.
a huge fan.
Um,
I'll pre-order
okay,
it as soon as it's available.
it has nothing to do with learning any kind of tricks for persuading people or even manipulating them or influencing them. This is a book about how amazing it is to be alive. Now, about a year and a half ago, I suffered a stroke and came within several minutes of dying. I learned a very personal lesson on that. But the idea is I have this fear that people nowadays are so immersed in their day-to-day lives, in their smartphones, in their social media, that we're all losing a sense of something greater, something larger in life, that it gives meaning to our day-to-day existence, that pulls us out of the banality of the 21st century and kind of makes us aware of how incredibly strange it is, not strange and uncanny and sublime, to actually be alive, to actually be conscious, to actually be aware of the world like no other animal is aware. I'm reading books now about physics and quantum mechanics, and the fact that there might be other dimensions to life, what they call the multiverse, or describing what actually happens inside a black hole. These are absolutely mind-blowing phenomena that scientists are uncovering. Also things about our earliest ancestors and about the deep past and about what's going on in animal consciousness. Things are going on in this world that are utterly, as I say, mind-blowing, but we're not paying attention to it, or we're not seeing it in that light.
At the top of the show, you heard Robert Greene, a celebrated author of the 48 Laws of Power, Mastery, and his latest bestseller, The Laws of Human Nature. We'll hear more about that deal and Robert's plans for his next book in just a moment. Also on today's show, we chat with Canadian director Michael Maxis, whose new feature film, Puppy Love, is set for release later this year. The picture features an all-star cast with Michael Madsen, Wayne Newton, Rosanna Arquette, and Hopper Penn as the primary protagonist of the film. Hopper's the son of Sean Penn. Puppy Love marks his on-screen debut. The soundtrack for the film is no slouch either and features the production talents of Butch Vig, LP, and Portugal the Man, who score the film. Michael also produced the music video for Orville Peck's Dead of Night, which helped launch his career beyond the fringe. That's a terrible pun. I do apologize. You're listening to the Portland Podcast. I'm your host, Gregory Day. More now from today's special guest, Robert Greene.
Some big news in the Robert Greene department. You're working with Dream Crew. This is Drake's production company.
Yes, I am.
Yes, no, it's very exciting news for you.
Yes, it is. Considering that this book, The 48 Laws of Power, came out in 1998, and starting maybe just a few years after that, people came to me to try and turn it into a television series. And since then, I've probably had at least 300 meetings with people trying to do it. And as you know, in Hollywood,
Wow.
people have meetings and nothing ever happens. So to actually sign a contract and work with somebody whom I respect a lot is definitely something worth celebrating for me. Yeah.
That's where you got your start too, Hollywood. That's what it's all about. So it's come full circle.
It's more ironic in that I really wanted to escape from Hollywood. I didn't like working in it. And here now I'm being sucked back into that world. So it's not by choice, but I'm
like the mafia.
Yeah, exactly. But, I know that the series, that the book can lend itself to something really, really bizarre, different and interesting in a television medium. So I'm very excited about it. I just have to get over my Hollywood phobia a little bit.
While you're working with some of the top talent in the game, I mean, Anonymous
Oh, for
Content
sure.
is, I mean,
For
they produce
sure.
True Detective. They've worked with Mark
Yeah.
Romanek. I mean, the best of the best.
I know. I'm very lucky. I'm very excited about that. And then I get to work with Drake, who's what could be better? I mean, he's a really smart guy. I really respect him. So,
Yeah.
it's actually destiny because 10 years ago we were on the verge of doing it with somebody else, and it wouldn't have been nearly as good as people that I'm working with now. So everything kind of works out for a reason in the end.
It sounds very romantic.
I'm not usually the romantic type. I'm
I
sorry.
know.
You're bringing it out in me somehow. I don't know why.
Right, the 48 Laws of Power. Now, Drake is set to direct an episode also. I'm curious how long the episodes are going to be.
Well, do you know how Quibi works?
It's very short form. I understand it's supposed to be viewed on the phone.
Phone or iPad or perhaps laptop, but mostly on the phone. These are like 10-minute sequences.
Right.
So we're just in the preliminary stages, and it's the thing of it. The great thing about Quibi is it's sort of a platform where you develop something where it's short, and then if it succeeds, if it resonates well with people, you can then take that same episode and draw it out into something hour long on a different platform. So it's kind of a good way to experiment with the series that you're starting out with your ideas to see if it resonates with people, and then to expand it into something larger. But it will definitely be a challenge to express a law in 10 minutes. I understand that.
Yeah, I think you broke the news on Jennifer Cohen's podcast. You had great rapport with her, by the way.
You listen to Jennifer Cohen? God, I have to tell her that.
Yeah.
She'll be so excited.
Yeah, she's great.
Oh, yeah, Jennifer's wonderful.
You guys had a wonderful rapport. You did very well on that podcast. She sort of helped lighten up the mood because it's such heavy material that you work on.
Well, it is. I guess it's heavy. Have you read The Laws of Human Nature?
I've read every book you've ever produced, and I've probably forgotten most of it, but I've internalized so many of the laws and the principles of your work. You are my favorite author. I'm trying not to come across as a fanboy. I'm trying to not be that guy that just is an obsessive fan, but I am.
Well, that's actually very nice to hear. I'm glad you did tell me. Well, it's heavy material, I suppose, particularly the last book, in that it makes you aware that you're not nearly as great and perfect and wonderful as you think you are. So I understand that there's some pain involved in some of my books, where you have to read about how manipulative people can be. But I try and make them entertaining. I always tell stories to introduce ideas. And it's the story component in my books, like in the 48 Laws, which is what we're going to be using a lot in the television series.
I particularly enjoyed the story of Jane Williams and Mary Shelley. What an arc, what a story arc, so much drama. She was just a really terrible person.
Yeah, it's a story about envy, and basically, people should know who Mary Shelley is, the author of Frankenstein and the wife of the great poet Percy Shelley. But it's just a basic story of how a friend, somebody who befriends you, can suddenly turn into an enemy, a frenemy, as they say. And basically, I think we've all experienced this, where somebody becomes a little too overly friendly with you and approaches you as Jane did with Mary Shelley. And then they're doing that so eventually they can hurt you. They can get inside, they can get you emotionally entangled with them. And then later they turn against you and they sabotage you. And, envy is a very human emotion. And the strange thing about it is, more often than not, we encounter it with friends than with enemies.
Absolutely.
So that was the story that I really wanted. And then in the 48 Laws of Power, I have a story. I have a chapter on envy. Damn it, the guy's, it's a famous British author who was murdered by his male lover. And it's an incredible story of envy. His name is escaping me now, playwright from the 60s. He wrote Entertaining Mr. Sloane. Anyway, so I've always been obsessed with envy because nobody ever talks about it, but it's something we've all experienced in our lives and will certainly be doing an episode on that in the new series.
Yeah, that was my favorite part of the book. I just loved reading those stories. Greg Nettles, the great envious, Yolanda for Selena, Michael Eisner, who was envious of Jeffrey Katzenberg, who you're going to be working with.
I know. It ends up that Katzenberg, he pretty much signed on to this because he's a fan of the 48 Laws. And I have a whole story, a chapter in the book about the whole Eisner Katzenberg saga. So I'm very much looking forward to sitting down with Mr. Katzenberg and talking to him about that. Right. But yeah, the idea is that sometimes the person who can be oddly enough the most envious is your superior, is your boss. You wouldn't think that they would be envy of you because they're the ones that have the power. But oftentimes, as I talk about in the 48 Laws, you can make somebody above you feel insecure, that maybe you're better than them, that people like you more than they like the person on top. That was the sort of law number one in the 48 Laws, never outshine the master.
Right.
And Jeffrey Katzenberg had violated that law. He had outshone the master, Michael Eisner. He paid a terrible price for it.
Oh, sure did. Aristotle Onassis led a miserable life. You've talked about this quite a bit. Multi-millionaire, married to, a very famous woman. What could be wrong in his life? Apparently quite a bit. His children apparently were not very close to him, and miserable billionaire.
Well, as a lot of them are. The point I had for that story was that I'm trying to show you the ways to combat the envy that you might feel. And we often feel envy for people who are very powerful or successful or wealthy. And here was the man, the wealthiest man in the world at the time, married to one of the most beautiful and certainly the most famous woman of the time, Jacqueline Onassis. And he was the most miserable son of a bitch. That he was just so unhappy. And you would think with all of his yachts and these women and everything that this guy, who could be happier? And the point is, you might feel envy for someone who's extremely powerful and wealthy, like Jeff Bezos or something, but you don't know their personal life. You don't know, they're probably actually more unhappy than you are. So that's just the point. It's sort of as a way to combat envy that you might feel for people who seemingly have more than you.
It was so useful for me personally, engaging in downward comparisons and enjoying the success of other people. There's maybe 2 people in my entire life that are happy for my success.
And who's that?
The last people I would have suspected. I mean, these are people who are on the periphery. My closest friends, none of them really like it.
Oh, I know. I've had the same issue as well. I get much more positive feedback from people who've never met me.
Exactly.
And who read the books, because they're not comparing themselves to me. They didn't know me before I was successful, and so they don't have these particular issues. Yeah, it's a real problem, but I hope your parents at least are happy for your successful.
Oh yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
That would be tragic if they're envious. Okay.
You tell the story about Milton Erickson in the book during the polio epidemic. This was a fascinating story, his life, learning 17 different types of no. Unbelievable.
Yeah, basically it's a chapter on nonverbal communication. It's a huge theme in the book, because I made the point that other people have made the point that 95% of communication between humans is nonverbal. I call it a second language. And most of it, we don't understand this language. We're not paying attention. And Milton Erickson was perhaps the greatest genius when it comes to reading nonverbal behavior. And the reason for that was very simple. When he was 19 or 20 years old, he came down with polio, and he was completely paralyzed, except the only thing he could move were his eyeballs. He could move his eyes. Everything else was paralyzed. And he sat in bed, and he was somebody with a very, very active mind. So you can imagine the sheer torture that would mean, where he couldn't do anything to entertain himself. He couldn't even read a book, and they had obviously no television back then, but the boredom was excruciating. So what he decided to do to entertain himself was to transform himself into this master observer of people. He had like 4 or 5 sisters, and they were always coming into his room try and cheer him up, and they'd be sitting there talking, and he would just scrutinize them so closely that he could begin to figure out the second language. Like when his sister touched her hair in this particular way, that signaled a certain kind of nervousness or excitement. They would say no, and their no with a certain tone of voice actually meant yes, or their no meant I'm not so sure.
That hasn't changed. That has not changed.
No, it hasn't. So, and then later in life, he became a psychiatrist. He was the person who basically invented NLP and the use of hypnosis in therapy. Later in life, people thought that this man was completely psychic because he could read your innermost thoughts based on studying your body language. So none of us are going to become a Milton Erickson. We're not going to get polio and so be forced to become like that. But it's actually a fascinating thing to study, and that's sort of what I wanted to inspire in people who read the book.
John D. Rockefeller and Lyndon B. Johnson, they used many of the 48 laws during their rise to power.
Well, yes. Yeah. We're talking about the stories and the laws of human nature, right?
Yes.
Lyndon Johnson is probably one of the craftiest American politicians who ever lived.
I love the passage of him watering down his drinks.
Well, that's a classic tactic that you'll find. Joseph Stalin did that as well.
With vodka, and he was drinking water. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if that was it or if he just watered down his drinks. I think he would drink. I'm not sure. You might be right. I don't remember. But basically, his idea was he wanted other people to get drunk, and while he didn't get drunk, so that and Johnson was the same. So he could retain his self-control, his sang-froid, while the other people got drunk and nervous and revealed their deepest secrets. Johnson's whole trick, and they called it the Johnson treatment, basically his way of seducing even people who hated him. His trick was to always figure out what people wanted, what they needed, what their secrets were, what they were secretly wishing they could have, and what they weren't getting. And by getting them a little bit drunk or a little bit tipsy, they would start talking, they would start revealing things. It was, very Machiavellian, quite manipulative. But Johnson is really interesting because there's actually a very positive element to his story. He had a way of listening to people that was very intense, and he had a great deal of empathy. He was also, there was a dark side to him as well. So he's not an angel by any means, but I'm fascinated by people like that. And if I ever recommend a book to people, I rarely do. It's like 4 volumes at this point, but the biography of Johnson by Robert Caro is absolutely one of the most riveting reads you'll ever come upon. And he does a great job of showing all these sides to Lyndon Johnson. And I've talked about Johnson in almost all of my books because he fascinates me.
And Kissinger, too. You talk a lot about Kissinger in your books.
Yes, I do. Kissinger is a little darker than Johnson, a little more evil, a little more Machiavellian in that he was so secretive. And he was more like Talleyrand in the 19th century with Napoleon. And I talk a lot about Talleyrand in my first book. So Kissinger is more like that, where Johnson, I don't know. I don't know who I would compare Johnson to, but yeah. And then, of course, Nixon. Nixon figures prominently in my last book when I talk about the dark side of human nature, the shadow. And Nixon had a very, very powerful shadow. And I talk in there about how Kissinger was Kissinger was an incredibly keen observer. And he picked up that Nixon basically had a split personality. And he sort of was able to analyze it and use that information for his own powerful aspirations. But these are some of the many characters that I describe in the Laws of Human Nature.
I'm curious about your next book, too, The Law of the Sublime. And I'm curious when this is going to come out.
You're really up on these things. I'm impressed.
I'm a huge fan. I'll pre-order it as soon as it's available.
Well, it's a little bit of a departure for me. It'll have a similar format to my other books, in that it's not a book. It has nothing to do with learning any kind of tricks for persuading people or even manipulating them or influencing them. This is a book about some about how amazing it is to be alive. Now, about a year and a half ago, I suffered a stroke and came within several minutes of dying or having permanent
It
brain
was a
damage.
blood clot in your neck, I believe.
Yes, it was, exactly. So I, learned a very personal lesson on that. But the idea is I have this fear that people nowadays are so immersed in their day-to-day lives, in their smartphones, in their social media, that we're all losing a sense of something greater, something larger in life, that it gives meaning to our day-to-day existence, that pulls us out of the banality of the 21st century and kind of makes us aware of how incredibly strange it is, not strange and uncanny and sublime, to actually be alive, to actually be conscious, to actually be aware of the world like no other animal is aware. Perhaps there's no other creature in the entire universe that's conscious. We don't know that yet. Probably is, but we don't know. And so this was something in the past that people had a sense of, perhaps through religion or even through the connection to nature or something like that. And I think we've lost it. And because we've lost it, I think people are very depressed. I think they turn to addictions because of that. Because I think we all need to feel connected to something that kind of transcends our day-to-day lives. So I'm using things. I find science right now incredibly sublime. I'm reading books now about physics and quantum mechanics, and the fact that there might be other dimensions to life, what they call the multiverse, or describing what actually happens inside a black hole. These are absolutely mind-blowing phenomena that scientists are uncovering. Also things about our earliest ancestors and about the deep past and about what's going on in animal consciousness. Things are going on in this world that are utterly, as I say, mind-blowing, but we're not paying attention to it, or we're not seeing it in that light. So that's sort of the point of the book. But you asked me a question which I went on in my long-winded way avoiding, which is when you can expect it. And you can expect it probably, if we're lucky, in 3 years, at the most 4, but I'm going to try and make it 3 years. 3 more years. It takes me 4 or 5 years to write a book. I'm sorry, but
you don't do it to 25 pages. You just don't do that. That's not how you do things.
This will be a shorter book, I'm hoping. If it's not shorter, my publishers will kill me, and I'll probably kill myself in the process. So it will be a shorter book. But as you get older in life, you don't have as much energy as you used to have, and I'm sort of facing that now.
I know you don't like opening up about your personal life, but you've got a very talented wife, Annabella, and I loved her film, The Love Witch.
Wow.
Beautifully shot, and wow, it must have cost a fortune to make this film. I don't know if you were involved in that flick at all, but I really enjoyed it.
Well,
kind of campy and fun.
I kind of lived through it because it was going on in the house. But no, it's actually not an expensive movie because she had it financed through private sources. She didn't work with a studio, and she basically made everything herself. She spent years making every single costume that's in the film. She helped. So in other words, by the time production started, she had done most of the work. So she could really keep the budget down that way. I mean, she wears many hats. She wrote the script. She directed the film. She edited it. She did the music for it. She did the costumes. She designed the sets. And if you have the energy and the time to do all that, then the film won't cost as much. So yeah, I definitely lived through that. And we have a relationship where if I have a chapter and I'm not sure about what I'm writing, she reads it and gives me advice.
Really?
And if she has a problem in the screenplay or some, I'll tell her, think about this, or maybe write it this way, or do this instead of that.
Did she help with the art of seduction at all, or?
Certainly. Yeah.
Really?
All of my books, yeah.
And your cat's a big star on your Instagram page.
Well, we have a new cat, unfortunately. The great and wonderful and almighty Brutus, who had been with me for 19 years and who saw me through 5 books. Basically, he was the one that really wrote these books. He passed away last year, and it was really, really awful experience because we were both so close to that cat. But now we have a successor named Jacques, who is also a tuxedo cat. We have a thing for tuxedo cats. Uh-huh. And he just turned 6 months old, and he's an incredible monster. He's really amazing. He's really wonderful. So yeah, I'll be dedicating my books to Jacques from now on as well.
Well, you're sort of used to isolation as a writer, right? I mean, it's a weird time we're living in now, but I don't know if... I mean, you've got this close family, you've got this great cat, and you're busy reading books and writing. I don't know if this is much of a change for you, but...
Well, I mean, honestly, it's not, and things are... I just don't get to go to my gym where I used to kind of do my therapy, and so I have to do that at home, but other than that, it's just my life times 10, yeah. I'm very fortunate in that way. And I mean, to be a writer, you have to be alone a lot. But I really understand and feel bad for people who are not used to this life, because it can be difficult unless you develop the habit of being alone and entertaining yourself. And I understand why it can be very trying, also dealing with the fears that we have now, and things are so uncertain. And that's not a quality that we humans do very well with, uncertainty and unpredictability. So I feel very bad for what a lot of people are going through, and I'm extremely privileged, so I can't complain personally, but these are really rough times for a lot of people.
Law 26, keep your hands clean. I love that pun on your Twitter. You got a great sense of humor. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it, Robert.
Oh, well, thank you, Gregory. Thank you. It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the 48 Laws of Power on Quibi. And looking forward to this. There's 48 episodes coming up?
Well, we're starting with 10. That's what they've paid for, but we'll do such a good job that they'll end up probably being 48, I hope.
Oh, glad to hear it. It. Thanks again. Really appreciate you taking the time, and stay healthy.
Okay.
And
you
looking
too,
forward to the next masterpiece from you. All right, cheers.
All right.
Appreciate
it. Cheers. Take care.
Bye.
All right.